All right, everyone. Happy Friday. Hard to believe it's already November. We are very excited to welcome you all. Thanks for taking time on a Friday to come on out and engage with us in this seminar. My name is Amy Lynch, and I get to co-chair a trauma-informed work group with Ann Russ. And it is my pleasure to moderate today's session, Trauma-Informed Thinking, Mutuality, and Collaboration. It's always important to all of us on our trauma work group that we start all of our seminars with a land acknowledgement. So this land acknowledgement is modified with the we, but the remainder of the content is from the Philadelphia Museum of Art down the street from Temple University. It is with gratitude and humility that we recognize Philadelphia as part of the Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape people. A long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, such as the Walking Purchase of 1737, displaced many of the Lenape from this land. This museum and our staff, now our university and our team, strive to understand our place within the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to the Lenape people and their vibrant communities. Today, including the federally recognized nations, the Delaware Tribe, the Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to the Lenape ancestors, past and present, by committing to build a more inclusive and equitable space for us to live together. And we feel that this extends to all communities of marginalization and who have been historically disadvantaged, that we must be aware of the historical impact of the trauma that they've experienced and how that comes into play in everyday life. Thank you, Anne. All right, so we always like to start any of our seminars with a grounding and or connection activity. It's just us making an intentful effort to embody trauma-informed thinking and create a readiness for participation, learning. So if you care to join me, please first consider taking a deep breath in. And as you exhale, reflect on the beauty you find in the image by Lou Delara of a bridge in Wissahickon State Park. Next, if you feel comfortable, invite you on a journey to think about someone with whom you have a close relationship. Who is this individual? Picture them in your mind. Then take a deep breath. And as you exhale, think of 2 kind acts this individual has done for you. Next, take a deep breath in. And as you exhale, think of 2 kind acts that you have done for this individual. As you are ready, reflect upon the positive nature of your relationship with this individual, the kind experiences shared, and consider what emotions arise in your heart, your mind, your soul. Now, when you're ready, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, reflect upon your body as it is right now. Where are you feeling the emotions related to your relationship with this individual? Take a moment to pause and cherish where your body is storing the joy of this positive relationship. Relationships are a bridge to healing from and preventing trauma. Individuals or groups living, working, and playing together who intentfully find ways to give and receive kindness, to believe in the positive intent of others, to find ways to cross the bridge to meet in the middle, or to work to get to the other side together to overcome a problem or to create something new. And it's so in this space of regulation and relaxation that we hope you will join us to explore life through a trauma lens, kindness, believing in all the things that we have in common, seeking positive intent, and creating supportive situations and spaces. These are all variables in mutuality and collaboration. I hope that you enjoy the talk that our wonderful presenters have put together today on this topic. And I hope you enjoyed this mindfulness activity. So I wanted to just take a moment to introduce our fantastic team. We have Elisa Garnick, who is from our School of Social Work, Jeff Garris, who is in our kinesiology department, Ann Russ, who is in athletic training, and Laura Cinco, who is in nursing. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge these folks, as well as all the other individuals in our team. This was a work group effort, and these great folks were willing to bring it all together and communicate the ideas from their expertise, as well as some of the other members of our group who are not presenting today. And so thank you all for being here. And I also want to be sure to thank Dr. David Sarwar, who is always kind enough to extend 1 or 2 seminar spaces per semester for us to be able to do this. So with this, I'm going to hand it over to our amazing presentation team and Dr. Jeff Garris.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for getting us started, and welcome everyone. We'd like to just state a couple of predictions, acknowledgements, and disclosures here at the start of our time together. And one is that you may already be aware of the impact of trauma in relation to yourself or to others. Trauma information, we want to acknowledge, can be overwhelming. There's more to know about mutuality and collaboration when thinking about trauma than we'll have time to present in this session today. Importantly, information and research about trauma is ongoing, and we can all make a commitment to continue to gather information on this topic. Please feel free to advance. Thank you, Ann. One of the other concepts we'd like to present at the start here is the idea of a safety plan. Some of the things that you hear today may trigger trauma in some way for you. So we can think about a safety plan as a set of advanced strategies that we can use when we're feeling threatened or unsafe. They're often physical or mental actions, and they allow us to stay regulated, as Amy spoke about, and to maintain our safety. Because trauma is sensory, often it's invisible. These are techniques that involve our senses. So we invite you to think about today, if you're feeling in the moment some activation around something that's said, that maybe there's a sound that's distinct for you that makes you smile, a favorite flavor of a food, perhaps a favorite smell, a texture of fabric that is just comforting for you, and perhaps a color, seasonal color, beautiful autumn color. It may be that for some, leaving the space would be helpful, and feel free to do that if that's the response that would help you to stay regulated emotionally today.
All right, thank you, Jeff. So important to include those. So the objectives for today from our seminar are going to be that at the end of today, we hope that you will be able to define mutuality and collaboration in the context of the SAMHSA 6 guiding principles, relate cultural humility to mutuality and collaboration within your relationships, to consider the factors external to relationships that may threaten mutuality and collaboration, and to be able to explore ways to cultivate mutuality and collaboration in relationships where you live, work, and play.
Thank you, Amy. So to get started, in the spirit of mutuality and collaboration, we are curious to know who's in the room with us today in our virtual room and space. So if you feel inclined, I'm going to release a poll for you all to just indicate your identity within this group based on these questions? I'll give you some time to answer those and we can see our responses shortly. All right, I'll give it another few seconds here and then we'll take a look at our results. Great. So let's take a look here. It's wonderful to see so many students here in our space. We have a number of faculty and staff, and some other individuals joining us as well, maybe from the community or other members of our Temple community. So wonderful to see. And then in terms of our career paths or our current, how we would define our career, we have lots of therapists in the room. We have educators, healthcare providers, advisors, and supervisors. And we all have important roles to play in, as we talk about the specific principle of mutuality and collaboration, but also just in general about trauma-informed approaches. So thank you all for being here. So as we talk about kind of grounding ourselves, we wanted to first step back and kind of center ourselves in this space of how we're defining trauma, one way to define trauma, and so that we can move forward in our discussion of the mutuality and collaboration principle. So trauma results, and this is the SAMHSA definition, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It results from an event or a set of circumstances that an individual experiences as harmful and or life-threatening that has lasting impacts on the individual and or community functioning in one or more aspects, including but not limited to physical, spiritual, social, emotional. And that is, again, not an exhaustive list, but some of the main areas that we can see impacts to functioning. And one thing to really note here is that events and sets of circumstances, they may be physically harmful, but they can also be emotionally harmful or both. And also that this is defined by the individual experiencing the event or circumstances. So one event that I experienced, I could experience the same event as another individual, and I might find that event is traumatic to me, but maybe not for the other. And so it's important to check our assumptions and let the individual, define that for themselves. And so talked a little bit about event. The 3 E's of trauma are another way to think about and ground our understanding of trauma. So we have the precipitating event or set of circumstances, the person or community's experience of that event, and the effects. As we talked about a little bit before, these can be in various parts of our lives, in just one, in multiple, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual. Go ahead and advance, Anne. Thank you. We also want to recognize the intersectionality of our identities and trauma. And so, and again, this is not an exhaustive list of all types of identities, but just as a visual representation to kind of lay this idea out. And so one example is, just to ground this, is someone could identify as trans and a person of color, And they may experience some compounding or complex trauma based on these various identities. And so we want to recognize that, that we have systems, that there's systemic racism, the potential for an individual to have had adverse experiences, in their life, and that all of these are intersecting and they're not in a vacuum. This person is moving through their life and throughout these systems and moving forward. Yeah. And so to discuss our first learning objective, for you to be able to define mutuality and collaboration in the context of the 6 SAMHSA guiding principles of trauma-informed approach. We want to jump into that now. Okay. And so SAMHSA lays out 6 guiding principles for a trauma-informed approach in organizations. And so again, today we want to really highlight this principle of mutuality and collaboration. And kind of to define this a little bit further, this is about partnering and leveling out inherent power differences in various different relationships in different organizational contexts. And so when we think of some of these inherent power differences in relationships we might see in some of the contexts we're a part of, it could be a patient or a client in the term, there are a lot of therapists in the room. So the client and then the provider. So there's an inherent power difference there. A teacher and a student, an administrator and a staff member, so maybe the person who's supervising, their manager, and the staff member. And so, the mutuality and collaboration principle is really highlighting that there as a critical role in healing within relationships. And so, as Amy mentioned earlier, trauma can be born out of. There can be relational trauma. There can also be a powerlessness in those situations. There can also be powerlessness engendered in an experience of, a natural disaster that can be traumatic. And so we want to promote healing so that we can accomplish goals within these contexts. And part of this healing can come from this leveling out and feeling like people can have that power back so they feel safe. They're not being subject to re-traumatization if there's a lot of that, if the power imbalances are highlighted or if they're not being attended to. Another big piece of mutuality and collaboration is shared and collaborative decision-making. And so this really, first trying to tend to these power imbalances and give more power to, the person or the group that may be inherently, in that lower power dynamic, giving them more of that power is going to just enhance and provide the foundation for more shared and collaborative decision-making beyond just getting feedback. How is that feedback being incorporated into the actual decision-making and it's a with and not for situation. Go ahead. We also want to step back and demonstrate how the mutuality and collaboration principle is related to other SAMHSA principles of the 6. A few that really come to mind are the safety principle. So when we talk about safety, we're thinking of safety within relationships, within spaces. And so there's that inherent relationship to mutuality and collaboration, feeling safe in those relationships. There's the principle of trustworthiness and transparency. So we are, trustworthiness, which we talked a lot about last year in some of our seminars, is, when we partner and we level out those power differences, it inherently can build more of that trust and can lead to processes, policies, and practices that are really informed by those who are being served in the context. Empowerment, voice, and choice. Again, I feel like this very, very much goes hand in hand with collaboration. Those who feel like they have, that the power differentials are balanced out, there's more empowerment, there's more voice, and that can be enhanced. And then attending to cultural, gender, and historical issues. So collaboration and mutuality is strengthened through knowledge and understanding of systemic inequities of marginalized and or minoritized groups. So this awareness can then lead to, furthering, the dismantling and disruption of some of these systemic inequities through collaboration.
Thanks, Elisa. We're going to move on to the second learning objective, which is to relate cultural humility and mutuality and relate cultural humility to mutuality and collaboration within relationships. And we're going to kick things off right now with a poll. I'll have this up in a moment. But we have a picture up on the screen and we want you to share what you see. So tell us what you think is going on in the picture. Describe the person on the left-hand side of the screen, and then we want you to describe the person on the right-hand side of the screen. And just to say, as you all are working on this, there's no right or wrong answer. We're just trying to see what your perspective is of this drawing. Leave us open for about another 40 seconds just to give people a chance to respond. So, well, in the interest of transparency, I didn't expect the answers to come up like this. I thought we would see summaries on the screen, but give me a moment and I will see what I can pull off. But in the meantime, as we're actually, let me. pop over to this for a moment just to show you what the answers were. So when we look at what you all said for what you see in this picture, we see doctor sharing information with his patient, maybe a person in power sitting with a person who doesn't seem sure about an idea, discussing pulmonary health, giving information, a doctor talking to a patient, an appointment, a doctor visit. So it seems like the pretty big consensus here is we've got a patient and a doctor together. When we look at describing the person on the left-hand side, some of you said a physician, an expert, maybe a doctor with a private office, a therapist, doctor, psychiatrist. He's a healthcare professional. So again, we're seeing a lot of similarities in what you all said. And then when we look at the person on the right-hand side of the screen, responses include the female patient, passive, that one's interesting. They appear to be listening, a client, a patient, waiting patiently and learning from the doctor. One person said they look a little bit nervous, but a lot of people saying a patient. We've got somebody who flipped it around and said it was a doctor. Other people said patient based on where they sit and their garments. So it seems like there was a lot of agreement on how we described this picture. I'm going to bring us back to our PowerPoint, and it looks like, again, we were in agreement with what's going on here. And the reason why we asked this question is that we wanted to know how you all view this traditional relationship that we could see in medicine or healthcare. With our answers, we tend to see the person on the left as the expert compared to the person on the right. And when we look at societal norms, that expert is typically viewed as being smarter and holding the power in this relationship. And what's problematic is that this traditional framework can be at odds with mutuality and collaboration. Instead of working within that traditional expert relationship, there's a push within a lot of professions to embrace this idea of cultural humility. Hook summarized cultural humility as the ability to be open to the other in relation to aspects of their cultural identity. Being open allows us to see the whole person and not make assumptions about them. With cultural humility, we need to see it as a personal commitment and active engagement in a lifelong process that individuals enter into in an ongoing basis with patients, communities, colleagues, and themselves. It's conceived as having several components, including openness, self-awareness and self-critique, egolessness, supportive interactions, and lifelong learning. Cultural humility is about how a person's culture and identity impact their life, including education, health, and wellness. Trauma does intersect with culture and identity, and we must be open to how trauma impacts others. As Grad said, the relationship between trauma and culture is a critical one because traumatic experiences typically demand a response from the culture in terms of healing, treatment, interventions, counseling, and medical care. More specifically, it's been suggested that cultural factors can affect historical trauma experienced by communities, how people experience trauma, the meaning they assign to the trauma, how symptoms are expressed, and whether certain symptoms or behaviors are considered abnormal or normal within their cultural lens. It also impacts the willingness to seek help from a mental health provider or people inside or outside of one's culture. It can affect how a person responds to treatment, as well as the treatment outcome, including who the person sees as sources of strength, resilience, and coping strategies. So how do we practice cultural humility? Tervalon and Murray Garcia first proposed cultural humility as an alternative framework to cultural competency posed for medical schools to prepare physicians to provide better care for the increasingly diverse population of the United States. Back in 1998, they noted that physicians had a distinct lack of knowledge regarding patient life experiences. To help physicians learn about their patients, they said that cultural humility involves being lifelong learners, working to redress power imbalances or that traditional expert model, and then also to advocate for and partner with communities. Interestingly, when we look I did a search on trauma in the original article. Trauma only came up once when they were talking about cultural humility. It wasn't even in the manuscript. It was a citation that they had regarding physical trauma. So even though they didn't address trauma initially, we really need to see trauma as part of culture. To sum up cultural humility, I would say that it's us, when you get into your jobs or in your jobs, being an expert in your job or your field, but remembering that we're not an expert on what the patient, the student, or the client's experience is. So let's look closer at that second tenet and power dynamics. When we look at that traditional model, again, we in society tend to view that person on the left, if we go back to the picture, having that book knowledge or being higher on the chain of command, and they hold more power, sometimes even all the power. And from what we learned earlier, trauma survivors typically feel like they lack power. I invite you to share your perspectives or what you think. Go ahead and put into the chat how you think a person with a history of trauma would respond to this traditional power relationship. All right, they might stay quiet or withdraw, and that could impact the relationship and the success of that relationship if we're looking at a person in school or a person who's receiving healthcare or mental health care. Fawning, freezing, they might avoid or leave. They might feel threatened, be more submissive. A fight or flight experience or response could even kick in. Yeah. They might not participate. They could shut down. Yeah, and you know, looking at all the responses that you all have, you know, what I see or what I would assume is that they might not benefit from this relationship, but they might not get the treatment, the education, the care, or whatever it is that they're seeking out of this relationship. And that is probably not what we want. Okay. So if we're trying to approach our interactions with others through cultural humility, what we're doing is that we're recognizing that everyone's complex and multidimensional. And this is going to be a step towards rebalancing power and encouraging mutuality and collaboration. So again, maybe we're seeing that healthcare provider, the counselor, the teacher as an expert in their field, but we have to remember that the patient, the client, the student is an expert on themselves. When cultural humility is used, there's more trust and the other person feels seen, heard, and validated. And that provider, the counselor, the educator, they're really working to see the whole of the other person. This creates a stronger alliance, and counselors who are culturally humble not only strive to be effective, but they cultivate a growing awareness that they are inevitably limited in their knowledge and understanding of the client's background, which motivates them to interpersonally attune themselves to the client and a quest to understand the uniqueness of the client's cultural background and experience. So think about your experiences in interpersonal relationships. When you've been a student, a patient, a client, a staff member, do you think that you're being seen? Are you being validated? Are you being empowered by the person across the table from you? If you are a teacher, a healthcare provider, a counselor, a supervisor, are you working to understand the uniqueness of the client's cultural background and their experience? We also want to look at organizations and systems. So what are they doing to align with cultural humility? And we can see some of those other 6 SAMHSA principles being important in how the system functions to align with cultural humility. So we want to consider, what are the policies like? What's the physical space? How accessible is everything? Are we recognizing trauma? Are we recognizing individuals and experiences? If this is an educational setting, how does the curricula address trauma and even historical trauma that people and groups may have experienced? Just want to bring in that third tenet of cultural humility for a moment. We have to remember that we don't live in a diverse world alone. We should have an understanding of one's own ability to uplift another. It takes time to build partnerships and relationships. The CDC has an interesting document, Equity Guiding Principles for Communication, and they put forth that we should focus on authentic engagement and active participation with community and members. We want to encourage people to tell their own story and listen to what they have to say. We want to make sure accessible, safe spaces are available. And those are all things that we can do to encourage mutuality and collaboration. Cultural humility also involves advocacy. So we have to advocate and hold organizations accountable to have that wide effort to build cultural humility and to build partnerships. I can pop these into the chat, or we can share things with you later, but there's not a great survey out there on cultural humility. But these are a few surveys or questionnaires that you could use or organizations can use to see how ready you or the organization are to practice cultural humility. All right, and I will turn it over to Laura.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anne. That really tees us up nicely for our next piece. So now we're going to be talking about factors external to the relationship itself that may threaten mutuality and collaboration. So what I want to just ask y'all really quickly to do is thinking about what we just talked about, writing in the chat based on either your personal or professional experience or some of the information we gave today. What are some factors that you think might play a role in collaboration and mutuality for people with trauma external of the actual relationship you're trying to build? Feel free to just jot something down in the chat. And I see that Amy provided those instruments for us for people who are interested. Okay, so someone shared, looking at this from an organizational perspective, a lack of collaboration and why is a topic worth considering. Fantastic. How the referral was made, the environment where the meeting is happening. So the actual physical space that the relationship is being built in, that's such a great example. What else might threaten the relationship you're trying to build? External from the efforts that you're putting in. The stakes. That's really great. And thinking about stakes, right? And how that influences power. What about one or two more? So I see a lot about power here. Oh, here we go. Experiences that someone has had with other institutions or opportunities for feedback. That's great. So we'll be talking about that in the next slide. These experiences of historical trauma and previous experiences. If you're associated with these certain institutions, a lot of that previous history can be put onto you. And so it's your job to really disrupt that. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about what some of these threats, what some categories of these threats might fall into. So first, we can't really talk about threats without thinking about our own power and privilege and the dynamics that causes. So we all have parts of ourselves that have privilege, and it's really important to acknowledge and analyze that. And so that's why when we're thinking about threats, the first thing we want to think about is who are we and what do we bring with us when we come into the room based on how we present. We also want to be thinking about whose voices or perspectives maybe haven't historically been considered or valued. And so as Crystal mentioned in the chat, if your perspective wasn't considered valuable in a space previously, it might be hard to engage that person in that space because they already experienced that trauma and hardship within that. Another thing that's really important to think about with threats to collaboration is accessibility. The first piece of accessibility is information. So thinking about the language in which some of these things are put forward, some information, so we know that it is such a privilege to be able to speak English as a first language, and all of the different information that that gives you access to, as well as the terminology that we're using. So if we're using words that are very discipline specific or higher level that maybe only experts would really know about, that really will get in the way of us trying to build that relationship. And also with media, with a lot of these things moving online, that has increased accessibility in some ways, but in other ways it has decreased accessibility because depending on the certain needs you have, we don't always consider the diversity of learning needs that occur when we're in these sorts of spaces. We also want to think bigger and think more about the historical trauma and harm. So we know that we live in a world with structural oppression. And so when you experience these things previously, it's really difficult to engage with institutions that have caused you harm. There also is just getting a bad reputation. I mean, especially like being in a system of higher education or being in a healthcare space, it's really important to acknowledge that we have perpetuated a lot of harm on communities. And while maybe us and ourselves have our best intentions to mitigate that, we do bring that with us when we wear that white coat, when we have that Temple badge. Temple has done a lot to move forward and to do right by communities, but like all institutions, we have to acknowledge that there has been some harm caused in the past and really try to work against that and try to rebuild trust with communities that maybe we previously have harmed. And then just finally, thinking about institutions, because we'll be talking in this next piece about research and the clinical setting and teaching and how to actually build mutuality and collaboration. That's why you all are here, right? How can we rebuild some of those things? I just think it's really important to get to know the history of the institutions that you are in, because that can really help you prepare for what might get in the way of the interactions you're trying to build. Next slide, please. Alrighty. And so as we're moving to thinking about cultivating mutuality and collaboration, I want us to always be thinking back to that trauma-informed approach. So if we're trying to build a relationship and it's not working, instead of thinking, oh, what's wrong with this person? Why don't they want to work with me? Taking a step back and thinking, what might have happened to this person or in this person's experience that maybe is making this a little bit more difficult to build a relationship with. And then even moving beyond that, to take it away from the person and putting it onto you. How am I, in the systems I'm a part of, how am I reenacting a traumatizing situation or a potentially traumatizing relationship? So I think it's not just enough to say, oh, what's happened to you, but also what am I doing and what can I control? And how can I try to rebuild that trust and build that meaningful relationship? So I'm going to start by talking about these principles in terms of the clinical setting and the research setting. So I wanted to open with this quote because I think the power of community can really be leveraged when we're trying to build relationships. But I often think we have a misunderstanding of what community is. So sometimes people think they are in community, but they're really only in proximity. We'll call something a community, but we're not actually putting effort into it, right? So true community requires commitment and openness, and it's a willingness to extend yourself and to know each other. And this is a quote by David Spangler, who's an American philosopher. So when we're thinking about cultivating mutuality and collaboration, particularly in the research and clinical settings, there are four general buckets of things that I think we have to keep in mind. The first is going to be to create trauma-informed structures to really set us up for success. The next is going to be to actually cultivate those strong relationships, and I'll give you some tips on how to do that. Then we want to make sure that there are things out of our control that maybe will trigger people, especially if they have a history of trauma and they're interacting with people in these systems. So it's important for us to be trauma-informed and recognize when someone is triggered and respond in a trauma-informed way, and then ultimately try to create a culture of trust and mutual respect. So first we want to think about the container that we're trying to build this relationship in, because that really matters. So we want to take a step back and think about our policies and procedures to identify places where cultivating mutuality and collaboration could be challenged. So if we're thinking about in the clinical setting, if there's a certain procedure that we know can be really tough for people, what are some creative solutions that we can come to make that situation a little bit less traumatizing for folks? And then also recognizing the limitations with that were within. So for example, in the clinical setting, I used to be a mental health nurse. And the first thing we did when children came on the unit was do a skin check. We had them get into gowns, and we had to check for any sort of instruments they might have on them that they could harm themselves. And that's a safety issue, right? So we have to check their belongings and their clothes. But we got together as a team and thought, could we brainstorm a way to make this less traumatizing for folks? Could we have them fill out an intake in the beginning to figure out maybe what triggers them, what causes them challenges, so we could really work to actively avoid those things? Could we also think about doing things in pieces? So instead of saying get totally in a gown, can we start by just with the waist down and then put those back on and then move upwards, right? It's not a perfect science. There were limitations to what we had to do, but there's a way to get creative and try to figure out how to make things more trauma informed. Creating spaces where we can promote intentional reflection and debriefing. Because we know that when staff and the people that we work with, when we are in a good place mentally and physically, and we feel really comfortable in our own healing, then we can really put our best foot forward. So instead of only debriefing when bad things happen, maybe having that active debrief process. I know in my research lab, I try to get my students together once a month, and we try to have that reflective space to share things that are going on, to journal through things in a research space, because we do a lot of trauma research. And so it's really important to continue to build that community amongst yourselves so you can build that relationship with the participants or the patients that you're trying to work with. We want to establish clear protocols and guidelines. Transparency and predictability are everything. If you're a nurse or a physician or a therapist and you say, I'm going to be there at this time, really do your best to get there at that time. And the more you show up when you say you're going to, the easier it's going to be for them to believe what you say. We want to foster collaboration and empowerment, as previously mentioned, by involving people in the decision-making process. So this might be for research, having a community advisory board, help you guide how you're going to recruit, have them look at your interview guide or your survey, make sure the language you're using is appropriate. And then we want to think intentionally about opening and closing that container. We want to make sure that we're entering a relationship or a conversation with some less high stakes questions to really build that rapport. And then we want to close it thinking about hope and moving towards the future. We don't want to end things in a really raw spot. So if you're a researcher and you're developing an interview guide that has a sensitive topic in it, really make sure that you're ending that interview guide with something that is hopeful, moving them forward, pulling them out of a state of activation. And there's a lot of literature on that I'm happy to share. And then you want to model self and community care, because the more you model that behavior, the more you give permission for people who maybe feel like they have less power to enact that, to actually take space for themselves to do that. Next is cultivating strong relationships. So not just like having a relationship, but really cultivating it. I use that word intentionally because it's kind of like a garden. Relationships take time. It's not enough to send an email and ask for a letter of support. It's not enough to just think you're going to know a community because you know one person within it. You really have to build these relationships with time. And I think when you're approaching a community or a group that you want to work with more deeply, whether it's in the clinical setting or in the research setting, I would first think, what can you contribute? What skills do you bring to the table? What do you have that could be helpful for them? Whether it's a financial compensation, we want to pay people for their time. We don't want to just pick people's brains and expect that they're going to do that for free, right? If you don't have money, that's okay. Do you have skills? Could you lead an education session on something? Could you provide some sort of a fundraising opportunity for them? And what are your mutual goals, and how can you work together to support each other? because we know that we all have common missions and goals when we're thinking about health. We want to foster open communication through regular updates. So if you're a provider and you have the ability to have that relationship with a patient over time, making sure that we communicate things. If we're in the inpatient setting and we're getting information from the doctor, we want to make sure, as a nurse, one of the things that I always think about is giving updates. Even if I haven't heard from the physician yet on when you're going to get discharged, I'm going to check back in and say, I haven't heard yet, but I should be meeting with this person at 2 o'clock, and then I will try to let you know after that. And just kind of creating a plan, not having people be sitting in mystery. Also creating ground rules. So we know, especially when we're getting into discussion spaces with people with a lot of different ideas, you want to make sure you can hold that space appropriately. So you want to set some ground rules on what can be said and what may be said elsewhere, meaning having things like respect as being an important pinnacle of conversations, letting people know it's okay to disagree. Saying that out loud can be really important, especially when you're working with students, patients, people who maybe feel like it might be harder to speak up if they disagree with you. And actually saying, you are the expert of your own experience and I want to learn from you, can be really helpful. And the next thing is just listen first, speak second. I think sometimes, especially as academics or people in academia, we're taught to like kind of take control of the meeting, and that's great. We want to provide order, we want to provide structure, but we also want to make sure that we really have the opportunity to listen. So baking that into our time with the patient or with the participant, having time for questions and discussion, and letting yourself know that silence is okay, and really giving them time to process, to think, and not just coming at them 100 miles an hour, fully infused with coffee, because I know that's something that I often do when I'm excited about something. So taking a breath, letting them process, and then respond in a meaningful way. And then finally, just thinking that we're trying to build a culture. So something that is commonplace of mutual respect, trust, and recognizing each other's contributions. Letting people know I appreciate what you did can be really helpful. Okay, so recognizing and responding to triggers or conflicts. So we're not going to pretend like building these relationships are all sunshine and rainbows and it's just going to be perfect. There's going to be conflict. We're human beings. If there's real healthy discussion, there might be a little bit of conflict. And as long as we manage that in a healthy and productive way, I think that makes a really good relationship. You know, if the people you're working with feel like they can challenge you on certain things, that means that you're creating a space that really is open, where the power dynamics are being leveled. If you feel like in that situation, you are the one with up in a position of power. So first, we want to engage in our own self-reflection to recognize our personal triggers, because there's a chance working and building a relationship that's something that someone that we're working with says triggers us. And the more we can recognize those things and try to have a plan to manage that, that can be really helpful. We also want to establish clear personal boundaries and communication preferences. And this, again, models the behavior that the people we're working with can also set clear boundaries and communication preferences. Maybe you don't want to receive work-related things via text. Maybe that's an invasion of boundaries for you. And saying that out loud can have the student, the patient, the participant also agree or say their own boundaries. We want to offer options and alternatives to encourage that collaborative problem-solving approach. So choices are key. I think that is something that is simple, and even just giving some people choice and control can help them feel like they are really meaningfully a part of the decision-making process. We want to promote a sense of empowerment in conflict resolution and cultivate a mindset of continuous learning and development. So again, just because in this case you might be in the position of power, that does not mean that there isn't more that you can learn. And then on the flip side, recognizing there's also going to be spaces where you're not in the position of power. And I encourage you, if when you're in those spaces, when you feel like you have less power, think about and look at the leaders that are in those spaces and pick from what they're doing, what you think is helpful, and also what you think, oh, I don't want to do that when I'm in a position of power in a space like this. So you can really learn from your surroundings and kind of be your own scientist and create your own method for how you engage with folks based on your own personal experience and also by learning from others. And it's not something that can come overnight. So seek mentorship from support, people that you admire, that you think do this really well. I know folks are always really generous with their time, especially at Temple, to share what has worked for them. And often I'm always getting new ideas for ways I can be better in this space. And then finally, develop a personal toolkit for conflict resolution. Like, go to some seminars, learn about conflict resolution, because conflict is everywhere. And that's one of the things that I've done in my own personal professional development that I use way more than I thought I would. So I encourage you to kind of build that toolkit for yourself, whatever works for you. So I wanted to briefly touch on this here because I am a nurse, and I think that there's something about this that really like clicked for me when I learned this. So the window of tolerance is something that it can be helpful to know because it can help you spot when someone's starting to like disengage or kind of get dysregulated in a space. And I kind of think it's a superpower to be able to be really attuned to a space and know, okay, something's not going right. I need to address this because I can see this person is becoming dysregulated. So I think often when we think of dysregulation, we think of this blue bar at the top. So it's really easy to tell when someone's maybe anxious or angry or aggressive, defensive, hostile, right? When you get triggered by something, you might react in a way at one point, right? We all have this window where we can be cool, calm, and collected all the way to a point, and then we all have a different point where it's like, oop, now I have tunnel vision. So when you get dysregulated, you can get this sort of tunnel vision. And so it can be really, really difficult to be able to make logical decisions and you can just get really angry. And then you're going to naturally feel unsafe in a space, right? And in the same regard, there's another type of dysregulation that is a little bit more internal. So when people were mentioning in the chat about that shutting down, disengaging, that's more of those signs of like hypoarousal. So people can kind of turn inward, kind of just start saying, yeah, not really responding in a meaningful way. You can tell they're not really paying attention. They could be totally disconnected on autopilot. And we want to recognize both of those things and then try to actively address it. Because if people are actively dysregulated and we are not addressing it in the space, it can get to a space of re-traumatization. And we don't want to perpetuate even more trauma than people have experienced. So stressors, triggers, conflict, fear, bad memories, feeling out of control, all those things can flip someone into a state of dysregulation and can make solving conflict very, very challenging. So we want to recognize what happens to our bodies when we're getting dysregulated. And what are some things that we can do to get back regulated, to stay really present in the space? And same for other people. And the last thing I want to say about this is we know that unfortunately, people who've experienced trauma, their windows of tolerances can get smaller and smaller and smaller because it's a survival mechanism. It kicks on because you don't feel safe. And if you've lived in a world where you've constantly not felt safe, you're going to flip on quicker and quicker. Now there is hope. We can slowly rebuild this with our patients, with our clients, with our participants, if that's the point of your study. But it's good to know because sometimes I think if we have our own trauma, we make it kind of hard on ourselves. Like, why am I get so angry so easily? Or why do I dissociate so easily? And oftentimes it's because of what we experienced. And so it's just kind of that knowledge can help us rebuild. And then finally, creating a culture of trust and mutual respect. So we want to like change culture. That's really, really hard. We're hoping that y'all are here because you want to be advocates for this culture of trust and mutual respect, that you can build collaboration and mutuality. So we want to make sure we cultivate a sense of inclusivity and shared purpose. Include them in the mission, include them in the purpose. We need diverse perspectives to really solve any of the world's health problems. We want to promote appreciation and respect for these diverse perspectives and really sharing that we are willing to be wrong. We are willing to learn. We encourage people to disagree with us. We don't expect you to agree with everything we say. Establish clear expectations and accountability mechanisms just to make sure that we're really meeting people's needs and we're meeting our end of the bargain and having touch points to see if we actually are meeting the expectations of all parties. Respect boundaries and preferences, as I shared, honor personal space and privacy. Really just, again, respecting the boundaries that people set and then modeling that for others. make sure we're always asking and not assuming. This includes about certain demographic information or just general preferences. Emphasizing teamwork, emphasizing the value of a collaborative effort and shared achievements, like really like build a team. And when you're building your teams in the clinical space and also in the research space, think about who's not at the table. And I think that can really help you figure out who do we need to bring in to make sure we really can look at this in a comprehensive way. If you see conflict in a space that it's your job to really manage, make sure you address it promptly and constructively. And then also really just lead by example, because people are watching you, especially if you are in the position of power. And so especially trauma survivors, we're really good at observing people for their reactions, their behaviors, their body language. So it's something that's really important that you really think about. If you are in a position of power, really being an example for what you would like a leader to be. Now, next slide. Perfect. Now I am going to pass it over.
Thank you, Laura. I just wanted to acknowledge and thank everyone for your attention up to this point. I know in webinars, when I get to about the hour, 60-minute point, I can get a little antsy at times. So feel free if you need to stand up, you need to stretch, you need to take a couple deep breaths. Laura did such a nice job in focusing on how do we cultivate mutuality and collaboration in the research and the clinical space. And we're going to look now at another important relationship for many of us, the teacher-student relationship. And I would just encourage you, perhaps those words teacher-student, they don't quite fit, but you are a mentor working with a mentee in some capacity, or another partnership with slightly different names that might fit better than teacher and student. I'm hopeful that some of the things we'll share here would be applicable. So why don't we start with a poll question, because we want to acknowledge things you're already doing in this space of cultivating mutuality and collaboration. Again, teacher-student is our context here, mentor-mentee. You see a poll question on the slide, and if you could respond in the chat, that would be great. So for those attending who are teachers, in what ways do you cultivate mutuality and collaboration with your students or with your mentees? Please feel free to respond in the chat. Once again, we just want to acknowledge the good work that you're probably already doing in this space, building mutuality and collaboration with students or mentees. It's just in the interest of time, let's just give folks about another 40 seconds here and see if we have some responses. Not seeing anything yet. I'm sure you're doing good things out there. So. And perhaps I'll ask our team members too. Thank you for that response. I remind my students that this is their education, their learning, and later alter content to meet their needs.
There is also a poll question going on that 8 people responded to, just so you know.
Oh, thank you so much, Laura.
I just put up on the screen the responses that came in for that.
Thank you, Ann. That's great. So let's see. I'll just try to summarize a couple of these. seek feedback and respond to feedback, to share power, collaborative goal setting, redress power dynamics by collaborating on student-teacher group norms for the semester, inviting input, feedback, etc. Try to get to know them as a person. Great. So thank you so much for those who responded to the poll. And there's just a couple of quick acknowledgements on this slide in this space of teacher-student relationships that we just want to acknowledge that teachers find meaning and enjoyment in their work through the relationships. Many of us who are teachers actually became teachers because we had a really important relationship with a teacher of our own. Students' relationships with their teachers are important contexts in which students learn and develop. And we just want to acknowledge that learning often happens around the content of a course or a class, but it's also learning that happens socially, emotionally, based on what a teacher is modeling in terms of social emotional capacities. And the teacher-student relationships matter for healing. That's certainly something that we want to keep in mind. Thank you, Anne. So there are two main areas that we'd like to present in terms of important things you can do as teachers. One is utilizing and modeling skills and practices that underlie mutuality and collaboration. I was thinking about these almost as the prerequisites. What underlies mutuality and collaboration? What can we perhaps personally take responsibility to do if we are the teachers or we're the mentors? And then we want to look at some specific opportunities that a range of folks help me in putting a list together that are intentional for students to provide input and share in decision making. So I'd like to begin with a bit of a framework. There was a former colleague here at Temple, Dr. Robert Whitaker, Bob Whitaker, who was a professor of public health and pediatrics. And I certainly received a lot of help in understanding trauma and trauma-informed practice from him. He gave a commencement speech for a medical school program called the Columbia Bassett Program. And although that was framed for future doctors and patients, much like we did the little thought experiment earlier in our session with the picture you saw, I think there's some parallels for thinking about teacher-student relationships. So we're going to look at three practices: lingering, listening, and loving, that I'd just like to suggest can be important to cultivating mutuality and collaboration. So concerning lingering, one thing we can be thoughtful about, we can get caught up, I think myself, I'll put myself out there with the being judged by the metric of speed, how fast one can do something, jumping from task to task. It can help to slow down, to go at a deliberate pace, as fast as needed, but no faster, perhaps. I know that's easier said than done. We can take time to wonder about what might be happening in a student's life when we're in an encounter with them. And that wondering can occur in the moment. It can occur after the encounter. And maybe a question we might ask ourselves along those lines is, I wonder what is going on with, and put the person's name into the end of that statement. Lingering helps one to be mindful and conveys to students that you understand, you know what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. So that's lingering. In terms of listening, it can be helpful to keep in mind that people are often healed through the process of telling their stories. And so certainly you as teachers have a very important role in listening. When you listen well, students feel worthy, they feel included. And I think a helpful utterance that we can use, particularly where we hear things that are not very coherent, often those are the individuals, students who need our most need our help, is using the phrase, tell me more about that. And then just being present and listening for the rest of the story, so to speak. So that's listening. And the third thing is loving. I just want to acknowledge, we're serving students, we're giving of ourselves, we're bringing gifts of teaching to what we do in the classroom, for example, and that relationships that heal have a positive emotion attached to them. And what relationship that has positive emotion isn't some form of love? So love is essential for health and healing. The empathy and compassion that I'm sure many of you already show your students is an expression of love. The compassion part, I think, can be important because we can be quite empathic, and it can be overwhelming at times, actually being empathic. But doing something, an action that is compassion towards your students, I think is very helpful. It can keep us regulated as well. And just to keep in mind that compassion is experienced in the brain, where we experience love with all the associated positive and elevated emotions. So that's loving. So again, just to summarize so far, we're sort of looking at what are at the individual level, being a teacher or mentor, what are those practices that are important for mutuality and collaboration, listening, lingering, listening, and loving. And what you model helps students go on to cultivate mutuality and collaboration. That's something we want to communicate today. Your modeling is so very important. And so they can go on to really use what you've modeled in personal and professional relationships. So speaking of modeling, I think one of the things that at times can be taken for granted is there's a lot of context in which students or mentees are observing us as teachers. And there's a few listed here on the slide. But all of those, I think, are important. And they may seem like very small things at times, just a short amount of time, a few minutes with other teachers, with staff members, our time working with administrators, those who are in power levels above us, frankly, and how we interact respectfully there. Other research team members for us who are also doing scholarship and research while also being teachers. Guest speakers, just even how you introduce a guest speaker and the sense that students get of how you collaborate. And also preceptors, site supervisors, cooperating teachers, maybe for those who work in educational contexts. Just an encouragement to think about all those little situations, little encounters that happen where you're modeling. So things that we can do to be intentional. And just as we go through these, you can think about if some of these you already do, and maybe we'll hopefully add at least some new ideas. One is in relation to course development. One of our team members had pointed out to me, which was helpful, that in the context of accreditation, it can be tough ahead of time to get students' input for curriculum. We're often seen as the curriculum experts. But there may be some time before actual approval goes through a timeline to get some feedback from students for course development. And after course approval, there may be an opportunity. Something I tried for myself for a course that had been approved, but as we know, sometimes a course is approved, it's not all fleshed out yet. And there was a component of a course that I teach called Historical and Philosophical Dimensions of Physical Activity. And in that course, guest speakers come in representing all different types of worldviews. And so I held a series of focus groups with students, freshmen through seniors, who had really demonstrated quality work in class. Did those focus groups a semester before, actually in the spring, for a fall course I was to teach, and asked them the kinds of questions they would want to ask the guest speakers. And I just found it very helpful to do that. And I just wanted to note, for those of you who work with preceptors, site supervisors, they often know the skill sets that are so vital to what they're doing day in and day out. They can be another important source to talk to and run curriculum ideas by. So again, that's course development. Some of the other ideas our group came up with, thinking about cultivating mutuality and collaboration with students, is class social contracts, or maybe you have a different term for it. But the idea that students can contribute to setting ground rules for group discussions, and those can be revisited throughout a course and refer back to see how the group, including the teacher, is doing with following those guidelines or ground rules. I had a really helpful suggestion from a colleague here at Temple, Michelle Scarpula, faculty member in Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And she recommended have students talk about the purpose of class discussions, and utilize that this fall in a class that has a lot of class discussions. And it was very helpful just to hear students' perspectives on, why would we even be doing class discussions? It may seem pretty obvious, but they came up with some interesting things there. Student-led activities. Students can be leading, for example, class discussions, including things like journal clubs. And another colleague from our College of Education, Jean Boyer, had mentioned and suggested that students can establish a plan, like a safety plan. We had a safety plan idea early in this session that we encourage you to think about if you're activated by things that may trigger trauma. But the idea was that the students could have their own self-care plan and could check in with the teacher. So in a sense, the students are taking a lead and empowering them to think about their own self-care. The other is course feedback. We have the classic after semester feedback that we ask students to provide through course evaluations. We might also do that mid-course or along the way at different times in a course, particularly if there's time periods like every 4 weeks where we're covering certain modules. So that's course feedback, gauging students' input. So again, just to summarize some take-home messages, I'd encourage you that if you haven't really thought about yourself as a teacher, and this teacher-student pairing hasn't been quite the phrase you would use, but in any context where you're mentoring, remember how important your life is, or you are in the lives of your students. Now remember how important your life is too, self-care. And that healing happens in the context of relationships. Encourage you to practice lingering, listening, and loving, and to be intentional about offering those opportunities to students to provide input and share in decision making, and hopefully break down some of the power differentials we talked about earlier. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And so to wrap us up, and we want to also leave some time for questions for those who can stay on until about 1:30. We did want to wrap up our discussion with another photo and ask you to provide some just reflection on what you're seeing here in this photo, thinking about what we've talked about, before and the first photo and maybe what you see or don't see. So we do have a poll up here. There's a number of questions, so feel free to answer all of them or just one or two, just so you can get a few answers for all of them. Give some time and then we'll share. Another 30, 45 seconds or so. Want to share anything else? And would you be able to pull up those responses if possible? Thanks so much. Right. So what we see going on in the photo, a team working together, discussion. I see the word engaging as well, and listening, which really dovetails well in some of the take-home concepts from our last portion. Healthcare professional, caring healthcare professional. See engaged again. Describing the left-hand side. Seems to be listening, right-hand side. Looks like someone was attuned to the gentleman feeling comfortable and speaking with the provider. Happy. Surprised to be validated. Interesting. And then how the photo, this last photo differed from maybe the first one we showed at the beginning of the session. Sentiment of collaboration. Diminished power hierarchy. Yeah, so kind of the positionality of the sitting next to instead of, a desk between, some of the physical things even that we can attend to and think about when we're trying to think about power differentials. It can be a very, emotional and logical, or, using our brains to think about this relationship, but what is the physical space saying as well? So that was a really great point. Provider is listening, patient is speaking. I really like that too. So there's that give and take, there's the listening and back and forth of collaboration and mutuality. Wonderful. Yeah. And kind of, like I said, a with as opposed to for collaboration. Thanks everyone for your participation throughout.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Russ, Dr. Garris, Dr. Cinco, Dr. Gardnick, for a really fantastic presentation, great content, and really practical strategies. Does anybody who's still here have comments or thoughts, questions? In the fall, we aim to be bringing members from the community who are out, organizations and their partners who are working and really embodying mutuality and collaboration in their everyday work. We look forward to your thoughts and questions and comments now.
Hi, this is Jean.
Hey, Jean.
Thank everybody. Thank you all. This was such an informative presentation, and it covered so much material. I think among the many themes that will resonate with me for a while is the thread that went through every single chapter, which is collaborating. And so much easier said than done. It's an interesting verb, and I know when I've done other trainings and asked people if they felt they were collaborative practitioners, no one raised their hand and said, "Not me." We all like to believe we're acting collaboratively, but I think this slowed us down to help us say, what does that mean? So I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. Thank you for that.
Jean, thank you so much for that really thoughtful comment and tying it into what you're experiencing. We really appreciate you being here and sharing with us. Just for students who are here and faculty, if you had students who needed to leave, maybe you could screenshot this. This is the QR code for students to be able to receive points and suitable. So maybe you could share it if you have students that were here but needed to leave. Anyone else with questions or thoughts, how this might apply to where you are?
I just wanted to share one comment. First of all, thank you. It's great. I think the whole relational aspect is a challenge, and we all need to work on. Just one comment on which is whatever. We often can assume things. We can assume things about the people. Even in the last picture, how do we know that the patient was not a doctor talking to a nurse about the particular results or whatever, or giving input? So the whole thing about assumptions, when we even see people, we have to be careful not to assume that we're interpreting even what we see correctly. So that's part of listening too, and learning through that.
Ted, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So much of mutuality and collaboration requires us to reflect on ourselves and reflect on some of our tendencies and patterns to respond, which often are couched under assumptions that we make of each other in snap moments or even in thoughtful moments. And assumptions can really get in the way of understanding that observing piece, that leaning in and listening piece, and certainly can get in the way of presuming positive intent as well. So thank you for bringing up that great point, and thanks for being here. Well, it is 1:30, so we are so grateful for those of you who could stay the full time, and we appreciate any engagement or follow-up with us about what you thought about today. We hope to see you all in the spring when we come back with community partnerships and organizations to talk more about how they live this out. So thank you again to our panelists and presenters, and thank you all. Have a great weekend.